the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It's Monday, November the 4th, 2024. One day to go, of course, till the all-important election. Some people viewing it as the last election in American democracy. Others, in fact, like myself, considering it a little bit more normally. But the one thing no one's doing, at least on Monday, November the 4th, 2024, is thinking about the 2028 election, except, for that matter, for my guest, Paul Greenberg, who has a new novella out. It's called A Third Term. Paul is well known as a writer on nature. In fact, he's been on the show before talking about his book back in 2021, The Climate Diet. But he has chosen to write a satirical book about the 2028 election, when Donald Trump seems to come back again. And Paul is joining us from New York. Paul, is this a Trump parody novel, or is it something else?
Well, in the novella, the Trump-like character, if you want to call him that, is just only referred to as the tyrant. And the scenario is that it's 2028, and this tyrant is running for a third term, which you may or may not know is not allowed by the U.S. Constitution. And so a Democratic political operative snatches George Washington from his deathbed in 1799 and transports him to 2028 to rehabilitate him and run him as the Democratic candidate against the tyrant in 2028. So the novella, it's in the satirical tradition of a lot of political satirical fiction. It's meant to be funny, but it's also meant to, I think, draw metaphors and parallels to the present election, the present dilemma that we find ourselves in. And this is one of these books that reality keeps outpacing the fiction that I came up with. Not just after letting the book out, the 45th president of the United States was on Joe Rogan, and he told him that his advisors said that in a fair fight, he would defeat George Washington with Abraham Lincoln as his vice president. So I'd only just sort of supposed this as a hypothetical scenario. Then already the 45th president of the United States was trying to game this out as a possibility. So it leads me to believe that this person is very untethered from reality. And
I'm not sure we need you to tell us that, Paul. I don't think anyone would, even he probably would acknowledge.
Yeah, and I, it's funny because I actually wrote this book back in 2020 and couldn't bring it to market then. And most of the time, I had a very famous radio host whose name shall not be mentioned said to me, "I love this book, but it's really just too fantastical, and we really want to stick with the facts." The problem is we're stuck in a situation with a person.
Who was the host? Why are you not giving us his name?
It was not shared publicly. This was not for public information, but somebody that you would have heard of from radio. And similarly, a very famous magazine, which you would have heard of, also had similar kinds of feelings that they wanted to really look at the reality of the situation, present the candidates as, this real debate between real people. But in fact, when you have one candidate who's entirely separated from reality, the fantastical and the science fiction is much more in order. And that's what I decided to do with this book.
Yeah, and it seems, the idea of bringing George Washington back to life in 2028 to go against the tyrant, who, of course, is at least rather veiled reference to Donald Trump, isn't that unrealistic. A few months ago, we did a show with Pedro Domingos, who's one of the world's leading experts on AI, but he wrote a novella like yourself, a Silicon Valley satire, which imagines an AI running for office in 2040. In a sense, Paul, I mean, you bring Washington literally back to life in your book, but it could just as easily be an AI, an algorithm. Is that fair?
It could be. I mean, I liked playing with the actual person who had actual experiences. And the pathos of the novella, I believe, is that George Washington was so done with being president by the time he stepped down after 2 terms. And remember that he stepped down voluntarily. He had no natural born heirs. He had a deep suspicion of monarchy, didn't want to continue the tradition, the British tradition of monarchy, willingly stepped down, and he was exhausted. He just didn't want to be president anymore. And so when he's brought from the past and he awakens and he says to Tonally, the sort of campaign manager, he says, I suppose a tyrant has arisen and, I'm needed once again. And it's with a great deal of pain and anguish that he has to take it up again, contrasted with the 45th president of the United States, who, I think of that line from the Iliad, when Achilles speaks of Agamemnon, the most grasping man alive. And I think of that as the 45th president of the United States, somebody who's constantly grasping for more, wanting more and more and more. And so I found the real character of Washington, who I really researched very, very deeply, that this was a person who had such profound humility, such profound bravery, such profound patriotism, that to bring the real Washington back and set him up against this person who has neither patriotism, nor bravery, nor courage, nor integrity, nor humility, that this was a way of exposing these things in a very kind of broad and perhaps comprehensible way to the other side of the political debate that doesn't seem to see this.
The fact you chose Washington is interesting. I mean, Washington is himself a controversial figure. Was he a slave owner?
He was a slave owner.
He was a slave owner, and of course, he was someone who was ambivalent about imperial Britain, certainly more conservative than some of the other founding fathers.
Yeah.
So presenting a slave owner as some sort of heroic figure to run in the 3rd term might be deemed, Paul, to be somewhat controversial.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, when I first wrote this book and tried to get it out there in 2020, it was right smack dab in the middle of Black Lives Matters, and nobody wanted to hear about the idea of a resurrected slave owner coming back to life. But if you look at Washington's writings, what he said, what he thought about, Washington was, like his opponent, was a real estate speculator. He was very, very land rich and very cash poor, and often in debt. And one of the reasons that he did not free all of his slaves at death was it was really kind of the only liquid asset, semi-liquid asset he had. And he worried about Martha and his stepchildren, that should they need to come up with a sum of money, that would be the only way that they could. Now, of course, my Washington is a fictional character, and I imbue him with a much deeper sense of guilt and dread about what has happened to the country. And at one point, he's being driven around town by one of the campaign people, and he spies the Lincoln Memorial. And he says, what did he do that was so important? He said, and the operative says, well, he came around during a time of civil war. And Washington immediately goes to this dark place. And he says, I suppose slavery was the cause. And the operative says, it was. And you see Washington just very tortured by this whole thing. And, without giving too much away, the slavery issue comes up and he has to deal with it directly. And the campaign has to deal with it directly. And even the tyrant has to deal with it directly. But in the perverse world that the 45th president of the United States has created for us, suddenly Washington as a candidate finds himself on the ropes. And he has to defend his record, but he also has to kind of go beyond his mistakes. I mean, the first line of the book is, a few days before his first death, George Washington allowed himself one last mistake. And that's really, it's not just an arbitrary line. My Washington, is a man who feels plagued by his mistakes. And he was, if you read his farewell address, which, albeit was written by Hamilton, but if you read his writings, he was always questioning of himself, always thought that he had made all sorts of mistakes. Remember, I don't know, Andrew, have you seen the musical Hamilton?
Yes.
So remember, there's when Washington and Hamilton have their final scene together, he alludes to a battle during the French and Indian War where he led his men into a massacre, and just through poor judgment and hauteur saw people cut down. And Washington was also one of those kind of like, in battle, there are these very lucky people who get shot at and somehow don't get shot. And after that battle, his tunic was literally filled with musket holes, and he walked away as somebody who, in a way, had kind of touched eternity. He'd seen his own mortality, and I think he was very, very deeply affected by that. Very deeply affected about being responsible for the loss of human life. So I wanted to play with that. I wanted to bring that out. This was not an unthoughtful man. This wasn't just a master of a plantation who didn't think twice about the humans under his ownership. I think he thought heavily about it, but he was also a man of his time. And keep in mind, slavery was.
Yeah, I'm not sure everyone is going to buy the idea of a man of his time, Paul. Washington, the one thing that I think can be said for sure about Washington and the other founding fathers, they're very well versed in the history of Rome. How do you think Washington have imagined Trump? Would he have seen him as an example of Roman decadence, as the kind of figure who appeared in the Roman Republic? How would he have historicized or imagined Trump?
I think it's certainly possible. I think, his first moment of sort of the first time he encounters Trump in any way, shape, or form, or the 45th president of the United States in any way, shape, or form, Connolly, the campaign manager, hands him a book, and he says, "This is how the tyrant imagines himself." And he holds up the book and he says, "So this tyrant considers himself an artist of deals, does he?" And then he says, "Very, very coarse, extremely coarse, but well titled nevertheless." So I think that on the one hand, he, certainly, yeah, with the background of the decadence of Rome, and also let's keep in mind the decadence of the British Empire. He did battle with a king who, by all accounts, was at least half mad. He understood that absolute power, of course, can corrupt absolutely, but it also can just lead to just strange thoughts, strange behaviors. So he understood power, I think, and he would understand the degree to which the tyrant would have been sort of twisted and tormented and contorted by power. But he also understands that somehow this tyrant has a way of speaking directly to the people. And I think on a certain level, he would admire that and appreciate that, but would have to work really hard to try and subvert that tendency.
Do you think that for a founding father like Washington, Trump was or Trump would be a strong argument against the anti-federalists, a strong argument for representative government over direct democracy? Because after all, Trump seems to have successfully established a relationship with a significant part of the American electorate, independent of the institutions. He's a very different kind of politician.
Yeah, I mean, it did occur to me, and in some early drafts of the novella, I did have him say something about the mistake of universal suffrage, which, of course, in the early days of the United States, there was not universal suffrage, and that was something that was granted over time. I think the aristocrat in him would have said, yes, this is exactly what happens when you have ignorant people casting their votes. But I think more broadly, because I didn't really want to get into that. And again, in a novella context, you want to keep it going. You want it fast. To me personally, what's happened is not necessarily that, this direct communion with the electorate that the 45th president is somehow able to have. I think it's more of a fact that we've undermined the educational institutions in this country progressively since, I'd say, about 1965, 1970. That less and we had this tremendous boost in public funding for education in the post-war era, in post-World War II era. We had a very educated electorate, and surprise, surprise, as we de-educate the electorate, the more likely they are to be swayed.
Yeah. I mean, Paul, you're sounding more and more like a kind of Hillary Clinton style elitist. She used the word deplorable. Hold on, let me finish. This election cycle, the word garbage was used quite controversially. You're suggesting that the only reason people vote for somebody like Trump is because they're not properly educated? It sounds very
I'm saying if you
Sounds
don't
rather patronizing.
No, I don't think so. I think that if you don't have a basic, one of the things that's been in huge decline, and I'm not talking about elite education, I'm talking about public education. One of the things that has vanished, and as a British educated person, I assume, may not have known this, but in the United States, up until a certain point, we had civics as part of standard public education. People knew, they read the Constitution, they understood how the organs of government worked, and that was a consistent thing up through the 70s and into the early 80s. But once you start cutting away, and again, it's not elitist at all. I'm saying we need to have the average citizen from a very basic level, from a primary school level, introduced to the basic forms of government. And even if it's not even in the education level, when I was a kid, we had this amazing thing that would show during Saturday morning cartoons. It was called Schoolhouse Rock. And Schoolhouse Rock was this very, very innovative way of taking things like how the Constitution was written, how a bill passes Congress, and turning them into 2 to 3 minute music videos. Everyone I know who's, say, 40 years old or older remembers those things and has internalized those things to the point that they understand at least the basic fundamentals of the American.
I mean, let me rephrase the question then. Let's say everyone took these civic classes that you're arguing in favor of. Would none of them vote for Trump? With that, I mean, his basic argument is that the country's in crisis and he's the man to save it. That's compatible with taking a civics class, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, and again, if you look at the Republicans who've broken with Trump, and many have, they tend to be older, right? They tend to be people who do understand the basic message of civics and the way government works. And where they ended up breaking with him was over these basic questions of what is this country? What are the fundaments of this country? So I think if you've had a basic education in civics, I think you'd have yes, I do believe you would have a hard time voting for the 45th president of the United States again. But, it's happening. And also the other thing, keep in mind, so we were chatting before the show started. I have a deep history of working in the former Soviet Union and working in the former Yugoslavia. And I understand very intimately how media can have a sort of toxic effect on the electorate over time. You look at the former Yugoslavia, for example, one of the main things that broke Yugoslavia apart was that at a certain point, the Croats had Croatian media, the Serbs had Serbian media, the Bosniaks, the Bosnian Muslims of Bosnia had their own media, and each form of media was presenting its own hermetic reality that never allowed the integration of other points of view. I think, let's put the civics and education thing aside. But the other thing that's happened, of course, is this fractalization of the media so that there is no central message and there is no central sort of objective measure of what sort of middle of the road truth is.
But is this book, I mean, it doesn't sound to me, Paul, as if this book is some sort of middle of the road truth, for better or worse. It sounds like a polemic against Trump and his version of republicanism. What's middle of the road about that?
Well, again, if you look at the basic values that Washington held firm, right? The idea of representative government, the idea of service, for example. You have a president, a former president who's running again, who dodged the draft 4 times. This was an individual, I'm speaking of Washington again, who believed in the curbing of power, believed in stepping down after 2 terms. The 45th president of the United States has multiple times said and floated the trial balloon of running for a 3rd or a 4th or even 5th term.
I mean, if he ran for 5th term, he'd be over 100.
Yeah, well, but, as I posit in this book, one of the things the tyrant says sort of out loud is one of the things that he sort of likes about being president and would like to have about being president is that the CDC and all of the medical research institutions that the United States has at its disposal can suddenly be his, and suddenly can be used to the prolongation of his life above all others. And I actually think that might be something that would be sought out should the 45th president of the United States achieve come to office once again. I mean, the thing
I
is,
mean, that sounds again a little far-fetched. You present this as samizdat, as a challenge to the ruling order from your background as a Russian East European historian.
yeah.
But it seems to me as if the vast majority of mainstream media is actually very critical of Trump. Is there a need for quote unquote samizdat against Trump? It seems every book, every article in the New York Times, the Washington Post, even the Wall Street Journal, and certainly online, they're all against Trump. So why is this samizdat?
Well, it has to do with what I was speaking about earlier about this fractated media environment where people only read their own media. So why I decided to go the samizdat route was a chance to potentially get this book to people who will automatically not read the New York Times, automatically not read the Washington Post, automatically turn away from all mainstream media, actually turn away from all paid media of any kind. Because once again, I think that the polluted media stream that is affecting a lot of people is mostly driven by social media. It's mostly driven by rumor, lack of fact checking, and so forth. Anyway, so one of the things I worked with a really interesting person named Polly Litovsky, who has a company called My Word Publishing, and what she essentially does is game the Amazon algorithm and tries to figure out a way, how can we move copies into readers' hands that might not normally even choose it. And so what we did was Amazon offers an opportunity for 1 week you can do, or for 5 days you can do a free promotion and make the book available to anyone who wants to download it for free. And we actually moved about 3,000 copies, which from publishing, that's quite a lot.
But you said that, I mean, your narrative is that the mainstream publishing industry was scared of publishing this book. You noted that you wrote it 4 years ago and that they chose not to publish it then and now.
Yeah.
There are a lot of books, Paul, you don't need me to tell you this, against Trump.
Yeah,
why were they scared to publish this kind of book?
Well, I think, first of all, you raised the whole question earlier in the interview about George Washington, the slave owner, right? Suddenly we've entered this period in American history where we can't even consider the first president of the United States as a hero, which I believe he was. So people didn't want to touch it on that level.
Interesting.
But people also didn't want to touch it because there was a certain kind of journalist that just says let's keep to the facts, and I understand that and I respect that. But I actually think that there's if you talk to all the novelists of East Europe and Russia and so forth, they often talk about there are facts and then there's truth. And I feel that what's being presented by the media is this thing that Trump says, that thing that Trump says. I think that what we really need to do is explore the psychology on a deeper level through fantasy, through science fiction, through imagining, through speculation, and present a scenario where we can at least think inside the head of this person that is potentially, going to be in charge of this country again.
This is not purely speculative, the idea of a third term. Of course, Roosevelt, who was a fourth term president in the end.
Yep.
This was a great debate. I know that you did quite a lot of research on FDR.
Yeah.
Was there the same antipathy towards and fear of Roosevelt in the 30s from conservatives as there is today, do you think, about Trump from progressives?
Well, there was. I wouldn't say it was, keep in mind the circumstances were very different. We were in the middle of a Great Depression and then a World War, in which there appeared to be some, grounding for continuity of leadership. So I think that dulled it to some degree. Also keep in mind that up until 1951, there was no constitutional amendment that limited the term of president. I think it's actually kind of remarkable that we got all the way to 1940 without anyone ever trying really legitimately to run for a third term, when in fact there was absolutely nothing but the precedent of what that Washington set of stepping down after 2 terms. Again, I go back to Washington's humility. I go back to the time frame that we were in just 20 years ago, when there was a degree of civility and a degree of honor that was at least cursorily part of public life. The fact that the 45th president of the United States has kind of done away with that whole thing, it doesn't mean nothing that civility and honor and all these kinds of things are just sort of pushed aside, and it's really all about ambition. Now, of course, on top of it, we do now have the 22nd Amendment. We do have an amendment that dictates that presidents do have to step down after 2 terms. But, and I raised this a little bit in a talk I did with the New York Public Library yesterday, keep in mind, look at Vladimir Putin, right? So according to the Russian Constitution, he had to step down after 2 consecutive terms, after 2 terms. Now, he stepped down, he replaced himself with a puppet prime minister, a puppet president rather, and he stepped back and was prime minister. And then a few years later, he ran again. And people said, no, you can't do that. The Constitution of the Russian Republic says you can only run for 2 terms. He said, no, that was 2 consecutive terms. And I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, to see the 45th president of the United States once again, were he to be elected, to say, there is that constitutional amendment that says we can't serve more than 2 terms, but I think it's consecutive terms. So I would think, and the Supreme Court, which has mostly bowed to the will of this former president, might very well just see that argument. And
are you suggesting then that Trump's America and Putin's Russia are moral equivalents in some way?
I think Trump and Putin are moral equivalents for sure. Absolutely. I think, when you look at, there was a minister of information under Putin, who's often referred to as the Gray Cardinal. And he had a philosophy around media, which was that the old Soviet style of just repressing everything, just letting a small trickle of state-sponsored media through, that we were done with that. But that the way really to control things was to flood the zone with a lot of nonsense, a lot of hate, a lot of verbiage, and then just kind of keep doing what you're doing. The media strategy that the 45th president of the United States pursued was exactly the same strategy. And I do think there's information sharing going on between those 2 parties. And I do think that there's a very good possibility that that information could continue. I mean, we know about the meetings that the 45th president had with Lavrov during the first administration. There seems to be a channel open that wasn't open there before. So I leave it, I'm not going to say that's definitely going to happen. I'm not saying it definitely happened, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there is a form of communication taking place.
That sounds sort of Trumpian in its logic. He always says that. I'm not suggesting, but there's some evidence. I mean, there were a lot when he won the election in 2016, there were all these rumors that the Russians were somehow involved, and that got disproved. Who knows what's going to happen, Paul? Certainly tomorrow someone's going to get elected. What happens if, in your view, if Trump is elected? What will become of America?
Well, I mean,
poor old George Washington, who you bring back from the dead for this novel, will he be turning in his grave like the other founders, Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison? Is it the end of the American experiment, the end of the Republic?
It's hard to speculate, even though I've written a speculative fiction. But I think you only need to look at the first term of the 45th president to see some of the things that might happen. I think there's, he's promised mass deportation. That's just things that he said. I think, tax cutting will probably continue apace, even though I think
what cutting?
Tax cutting will.
Well, that's hardly. I mean, that's happened many times in the past,
Sure.
often by presidents who are now beloved, like Reagan. So, I mean, there's nothing dangerous about that, is there, from the point of view of the American Republic?
I mean, you're asking me to speculate what will definitely happen. What could happen, I think, is a further erosion of these institutions that we consider democratic. I think that there could be a further degradation of the electoral system, the ability of the people to choose their own leaders, the questioning of state electoral boards. Will this be the last free election that the United States has ever seen? I would hope not, but at the same time, we're already seeing a great deal of action to try and undermine the authority of state and local election boards. So I think a lot of this stuff is on the table, and I think it's very, very plausible that these things could continue, and especially if you continue to have a Supreme Court that's now 6-3, if it ends up 7-2 or even 8-1, who's to say what's going to happen? And the degree to which, one of the ways that tyrants typically control a government is by putting the judiciary under their thumb. You saw Netanyahu trying to do this and huge public protests. But once the judiciary ceases to be independent, then what kind of government do you have? What are you actually talking about when you talk about a democracy?
Yeah, and of course FDR tried to perhaps change the Supreme Court, and that was one of his few political failures. Finally, Paul, Washington, of course, was first and foremost, as you say, a soldier, then a politician.
Yeah.
Some of the most heroic figures, I think, in the first Trump administration, at least from a patriotic point of view, were soldiers. Kelly, for example, and General Miley. Do you examine this, the sort of the military aspect of Washington, the fact that he was first and foremost a soldier? That's what defined his view of the world, and perhaps in the future, the fate of the American Republic might be determined by the military. I always assume that most guys in the military, in the American, certainly senior military people, are not particularly impressed with Trump's denigration of American heroes like Kelly and Miley.
Yeah, well, I mean, and they've come on record to say that this guy is not good for the military. He's not good for the country. I think going back to what Washington would say, I don't think he loved the military. I think he, having witnessed suffering firsthand under his command, he understood the really grave responsibility of getting the military involved in any particular action. What's very interesting about Washington is he was actually very constitutionally opposed to dueling. Unlike Alexander Hamilton, who died in a duel, and many people in his milieu, Washington detested dueling, absolutely detested it. But if those people who get a chance to read a third term get to the end, you'll see that, it comes to a certain point where Washington has to ask that question of himself. So going back to your initial question, I think, again, Washington set a lot of precedences, right? He stepped down after 2 terms. He didn't consider himself a monarch. He didn't have children that he wanted to bequeath the presidency or the kingdom to. In the same way, I don't think he wanted a military government. I don't think he wanted generals running the show. And it was with a great deal of relief that he stepped down and ended that possibility. So I think, no, I don't think he would want a militaristic government. And I actually, I think those people who serve honorably in the military, who understand the American government, who, again, and I go back to this, have a basic understanding of civics, I don't think they want to run the government either. What we want is a government that understands the power of force, but at the same time understands the power of human integrity and the power of human choice.
The model might, in fact, be, of course, John McCain, who Trump famously belittled. So, Paul, the election is tomorrow. I have to ask you, you're probably going to dodge the question, who's going to win? I mean, I know who you want to win. We all want the same thing. But who is going to win?
Harris is going to win, I think, because I think we're seeing late-breaking women turning towards her. The early returns seem to be showing. We just saw that Iowa is flipping as we speak. So I think we're going to be surprised tomorrow, and we're going to see a lot of happy faces, let's say, on the blue side of things.
Well, I hope you're right. Paul Greenberg, the author of a really entertaining new, what you call a novella, a third term. It's available on Amazon. It's already the #1 new release in political humor. You're doing something right, Paul. You're not known as a humorist in terms of your writing. You're famous for your books on the environment, but it's an important addition. Congratulations, Paul Greenberg, on the new book, a third term, a novella. And we will talk, I think, before certainly 2028, and we'll know who indeed will be the new American president. So, Paul, keep well, keep safe, and we'll talk again in the not too distant future. And I hope you're right on the Harris victory. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Take care.
Can I step on the scene? I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keene. Yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He is the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. he's an expert.